You must not imagine yourself special, the Duke of Ashford told his betrothed 3 days before their wedding. There are hundreds like you, poor, pretty enough, sensible enough, glad of the match. I chose you because my family required me to choose someone, and you were the least objectionable of the candidates. I tell you this now, kindly, so that you enter our marriage without illusions. I do not love you. I shall not pretend to. You will be my duchess, and you will want for nothing, and in exchange, you will not trouble me with expectations of affection I have no intention of meeting. It is a fair arrangement. Do not romanticize it. There are hundreds of women who would take your place tomorrow and be grateful. You happen to be the one standing here. That is all it is. He said it, this cold catalogue of her replaceability, and then he returned to his correspondence, expecting, as he expected of everything, that it would be absorbed and accepted, that his betrothed would murmur something suitable and withdraw, and that the wedding would proceed in 3 days as arranged. Miss Verity Lord did not murmur something suitable. She stood very still for a moment in the great cold library of Ashford Court, absorbing what he had said, the whole of it, the hundreds like you, the least objectionable, the plain instruction not to imagine herself special, and something that had been bending in her for the whole of their strange courtship, bending and bending under the weight of his indifference, finally, quietly, broke, not into tears, into clarity. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, "for your honesty. I mean that. Most men in your position would have lied, would have paid me pretty compliments, and let me discover the truth of your indifference, slowly, over years, after it was too late to matter. You have told me plainly, 3 days before the wedding, exactly what I am to you. One of hundreds, interchangeable, chosen for being least objectionable, to be married and then ignored. That is a great courtesy, in its cold way, because it has spared me a lifetime of slowly learning it, and it has made my own decision very simple, so I will return your honesty with mine." She drew off the betrothal ring, the great cold Ashford diamond, and set it down on the desk beside his correspondence, precisely, without a tremor. "I decline to marry you." The Duke of Ashford looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "I decline the match," Verity said. "You have just explained to me that I am one of hundreds, that any of them would do as well, that you feel nothing for me, and intend to feel nothing, and that I am to expect nothing in return for the surrender of my whole life into your keeping. And I find, Your Grace, that I would rather be poor and free, and no one's least objectionable option, than be a duchess on those terms. You say there are hundreds like me. Very well, marry one of them. It will make no difference to you. You have said so yourself. Any of them would serve. But it makes a great difference to me, because I have only the one life, and I discover, standing here, that I am not willing to spend it being tolerated by a man who has told me to my face that I am replaceable. I am worth more than that. Not more than other women. I lay no claim to being finer than your hundreds, but more than this. Every person is worth more than being someone's least objectionable option. I did not know it until you said it aloud, and now that I know it, I cannot unknow it, and I cannot marry you. The ring is on the desk. I wish you well. I hope you find one of your hundreds who does not mind. Good day, Your Grace." And Verity Lord curtsied, a perfect, dignified, final curtsy, and walked out of the library of Ashford Court, and out of the house, and out of the Duke of Ashford's life, 3 days before she was to have become his duchess, leaving the great cold diamond gleaming on the desk beside his letters. The Duke of Ashford sat and stared at the ring. He was, at first, merely annoyed. It was inconvenient. The wedding was arranged, the guests invited. His family would be displeased. It would all have to be unwound, and there would be talk. He told himself this was the whole of what he felt, inconvenience, and that the girl was a fool to throw away a dukedom over a few plain words, and that she would very likely be back within the week, tearful and reconsidering, once the reality of her poverty reasserted itself. She did not come back within the week. She did not come back at all. And the Duke of Ashford discovered, slowly, over the days and then the weeks that followed, that the annoyance was not, in fact, the whole of what he felt, that underneath it was something else, something he had not anticipated and did not know how to name, a strange, persistent hollowness, a sense of a room having gone quiet, that he could not account for, because by his own reckoning, nothing of any value had left his life. There were hundreds like her. He had said so, and meant it. She was replaceable. Any sensible poor gentlewoman would serve as well. He had lost nothing but an inconvenience. So he told himself. And he did not understand, for a long time, why the telling did not work, why the hollowness did not fill, why the quiet room stayed quiet, why he found himself, at odd moments, turning to say something to a person who was not there, and stopping, confused, and why the great cold diamond, which he had put away in its case, seemed to reproach him every time he opened the drawer. It would take him a year to understand it, a full turn of the seasons, and by the time he understood it, he would have learned the one thing his rank and his coldness and his whole armored life had conspired to keep him from ever learning, that when you tell someone there are hundreds like them, and they believe you enough to leave, you do not discover that you were right. You discover, far too late, that they were the only one. The trouble with the Duke of Ashford's theory that there were hundreds like Verity Lord was that, as the year wore on, the evidence mounted relentlessly against it. He tried, in the spring, to prove it, to replace her, as he had said any of hundreds could be. His family, relieved that he had come to his senses, produced candidates, suitable young women, poor and pretty enough, and glad of the match, exactly as he had described. And the Duke of Ashford met them, one after another, and found, to his growing bewilderment and mounting irritation, that not one of them would do. He could not have said why. They were everything he had specified. They were sensible and presentable, and they wanted him, or wanted his title, which he had always considered the same thing, and now, disturbingly, was not sure was. And each of them left him colder and hollower than the last, until he stopped meeting them, because the whole exercise had begun to feel like a slow proof of a thing he did not want proven, that the interchangeable hundreds were not, in fact, interchangeable at all, and that the one he had let walk away had been different in some way he had been too blind to see while he had her, and could not stop seeing now that she was gone. He began to catalogue her absence, the way he had once catalogued her replaceability, and the catalogue undid him by degrees. He noticed, first, the small things, because it was the small things she had done that no replacement thought to do. Verity had known the name of every servant in the house, and had asked after their families. The household had run warmer for it, and now ran cold again, and the Duke, who had never noticed the warmth while it lasted, noticed the cold acutely. Verity had rearranged the neglected library into something a person might actually use, and had left half-read books with her notes in the margins, sharp, funny, intelligent notes, in a hand he found himself seeking out, reading her thoughts on the pages, the only conversation with her he had left. Verity had, he discovered from his steward, quietly corrected a dozen small injustices on the estate during their brief engagement. A pension restored here, a harsh overseer checked there. Things she had done without fuss and without telling him, because they were simply right, and which had all, in the year since, quietly come undone, so that the estate itself seemed to miss her. And he noticed most of all the thing he could not catalogue because it had no single form, that she had been, in the months of their cold engagement, the only person in his whole life who had spoken to him as though he were a man rather than a rank. He had not valued it. He had barely registered it. She had argued with him, teased him, told him plain truths, treated him with a warm, exasperated humanity that he had received as his due and dismissed as unimportant. And now that it was gone, now that he was surrounded once more by people who only ever agreed with him, and feared him, and wanted things from him, he understood, with a slow horror, that Verity Lord's warm, honest humanity had been the single most valuable thing that had ever entered his cold life, and that he had looked at it and said, "There are hundreds like you," and let it walk out the door. There were not hundreds like her. There was not one like her. He had had the only one, and he had told her she was replaceable, and she had believed him enough to leave, and he had discovered, far too late, exactly as such men always discover it, that the thing he had dismissed as ordinary had been the rarest thing in the world, and that its loss had left a hole in his life that all his hundreds of candidates could not begin to fill, because the hole was shaped exactly like Verity Lord, and nothing else would fit it. By the autumn, a full year after she had set the diamond on his desk and walked away, the Duke of Ashford was a changed and haunted man, and the change had gone deep enough that he had begun, at last, to understand not merely that he missed her, but why she had gone, that the cold, arrogant catalogue he had recited to her had been monstrous, that he had told a good woman she was worth nothing to him and expected her gratitude, and that her walking away had not been a fool throwing off a dukedom, but a woman of dignity refusing to be told she was worthless, and that the very act that had so inconvenienced him, the walk-away, was itself the proof of exactly the worth he had denied she had. A replaceable woman would have taken the dukedom and the diamond and the coldness, and been grateful. Only a woman of rare and unbreakable dignity would have set the diamond down and walked into poverty, rather than accept being told she was one of hundreds. Her leaving had proven her irreplaceable. He had, by his own cruelty, produced the one demonstration that could refute it. There was one night, deep in that year, that broke the last of his denial, and it was the night of the margin notes. He had been unable to sleep. This had become common. And he had gone down to the library. The library Verity had reorganized, and he had taken down a book at random, and it had fallen open to a page where she had written, in her small clear hand in the margin, a note. It was nothing momentous, a wry observation disagreeing with the author, a joke, the kind of thing she had scattered through 100 of his books during their engagement, thinking, no doubt, that no one would ever read them. But the Duke of Ashford read it, standing in the cold library at 2 a.m, and he heard her voice in it so clearly, the warmth, the wit, the fearless intelligence, that it was as though she had spoken aloud in the empty room, and the loss of her hit him with a force that drove the breath out of him and sent him down into a chair. He spent the rest of that night reading her margins. He went from book to book, hunting them out, and there were dozens, a whole hidden conversation she had left behind in the margins of his library, an entire portrait of her mind, funny and sharp and kind, scattered through his shelves, where he had never troubled to look, while he had the living woman herself to ignore. And the Duke of Ashford sat on the floor of his own library, surrounded by books full of the marginal thoughts of the woman he had told was one of hundreds, and he wept, actually wept, the great cold Duke of Ashford, alone at 3 a.m. over a dead woman's handwriting, except she was not dead, she was merely gone, which was worse, because dead she could not have refused him, and gone she had, and did. There are not hundreds like you, he said aloud, to the empty library, to the margins, to no one. There was never anyone like you. I had the only one, and I looked at her, and I called her ordinary, and I let her go. God forgive me. There was only ever the one. It was the first time he had said it aloud, and saying it aloud made it real, and its reality was the most painful thing he had ever carried. The meetings with the candidates, which he had already begun by then, only drove the truth deeper. There had been a Miss Fairfax, sensible and pretty and poor, precisely as he had once specified, and the Duke had sat across from her at dinner and found her perfectly agreeable and perfectly hollow, a pleasant nothing, and had caught himself, halfway through the evening, waiting for her to say something sharp and true, to tease him, to disagree with him, to bring some warmth into the cold, correct room. And she never did, because she was frightened of him, because she wanted his title, because she was exactly the interchangeable candidate he had told Verity she was one of, and the difference between her and Verity Lord was the difference between a painted fruit and a living orchard. He had ended the dinner early. He had ended the next such dinner earlier, and by the third he had understood that he was not looking for a wife at all, and never had been. He was looking for Verity, in the faces of women who were not Verity, and finding, each time, only the fresh proof that she could not be found among them, because there were not hundreds like her. There was only her, and she was in a cathedral town he did not know the name of, having built a life he had no part in, while he sat in cold dining rooms discovering, one hollow candidate at a time, the exact and irreplaceable shape of what he had thrown away. Verity Lord, meanwhile, had not spent the year pining. That was the thing that would most astonish the Duke of Ashford when at last he found her, and the thing that most completely undid him. She had walked out of Ashford Court with nothing but her dignity, and a small portion left her by her mother, and she had used the one and stretched the other, and she had built, over the year, a life that was entirely her own. She had taken a small cottage in a cathedral town, and she had done a bold and unusual thing for a gentlewoman. She had opened a school, a small one, for the daughters of tradesmen and the genteel poor, teaching the things Verity herself knew, letters, sums, history, and, more than these, the quiet, unteachable confidence of a woman who had looked a duke in the eye and told him she was worth more than his indifference. The school prospered. Verity had a gift for it, and word spread, and within the year she was not poor, not rich, but independent, a woman of her own means and her own consequence, respected in her town, mistress of her own life, answerable to no one. And she was happy. That was the plain, astonishing fact of it. She had refused a dukedom and walked into uncertainty, and she had landed not in ruin but in a life that fit her, a life she had made with her own hands, and she found she did not regret the diamond for one moment. She thought of the Duke of Ashford rarely, and when she did, it was without bitterness, with a kind of distant gratitude even, because his cold honesty had shaken her out of the slow surrender her poverty had been leading her toward, and had sent her, by a hard road, to a life immeasurably better than the gilded cage she had escaped. The building of that life had not been easy, and Verity was proud of it, precisely because it had not been easy. She had arrived in the cathedral town with almost nothing, the small portion from her mother, a trunk of clothes, and the hard, bright resolve of a woman who had just refused a dukedom, and had therefore, she reasoned, already done the most frightening thing she would ever have to do, so that everything after must be easier by comparison. She had taken 2 rooms over a chandler's shop, and lived carefully, and thought about what she could do, for a gentlewoman alone had few honest options, and Verity had considered and rejected the usual ones: companion, governess, the slow genteel dependence she had just escaped and had no intention of re-entering. Before arriving at the bold one, she would teach, not in someone else's house as a servant, but in her own, as a mistress, on her own terms. She had begun with 2 pupils, the chandler's own daughter and the daughter of a widowed draper, taught in her 2 small rooms, for modest fees, and she had taught them so well and with such warmth, and had given them not merely their letters and sums, but the thing Verity herself had in abundance, and most poor girls were starved of, the confidence to believe they were worth educating at all. That word had spread, mother to mother, through the middling families of the town who wanted their daughters to have more than they had had. Within 6 months, she had a dozen pupils and had taken the lease on a proper little house. Within a year, she had a waiting list, and an assistant, and a reputation, and an income that made her not merely independent, but comfortable, and a standing in the town that was entirely her own, earned, unassailable, owed to no man living. And she found, in the building of it, the thing she had never had in all her years of genteel dependence. She found that she was good at something, and needed by people, and the author of her own days. She rose when she chose. She answered to no one. She spent her earnings as she saw fit, on her school and her pupils and small kindnesses to the town, and she watched the daughters of tradesmen leave her little school able to read and reckon and, more than that, to hold their heads up and believe themselves worth something, and she thought that there was no coronet in England she would trade for the sight of it. She had been told she was one of hundreds, replaceable, ordinary, and she had answered by making herself, entirely with her own 2 hands, a woman whom her whole town knew to be irreplaceable, the schoolmistress, Miss Lord, who had changed the prospects of a generation of the town's daughters, and whom no one who knew her would ever have dreamed of calling ordinary. She thought, sometimes, of what her life would have been had she stayed, had she taken the diamond and become the Duchess of Ashford, tolerated and ignored in a cold great house, wanting for nothing, but valued at nothing, one of hundreds who would have served as well. And she shuddered, and gave thanks, quietly, to the cold man who had set her free with 4 cruel words, and turned back to her pupils, and was happy. Not the fragile, hopeful happiness of a poor girl who has caught a duke, but the deep, unshakable happiness of a woman who has built her own life and knows exactly what it is worth, because she built every brick of it herself. That was the woman the Duke of Ashford would find. When at last he came, not a discarded thing waiting to be reclaimed, but a whole and rooted and joyful person, complete without him, who could be won, if she could be won at all, only as one wins a free equal, by becoming worthy, and asking, and leaving her entirely free to say no. She did not hate him. She had simply, cleanly, moved beyond him, into a life where he did not signify, and she expected never to see him again, and did not particularly wish to. She had proven, without setting out to, the thing that most confounds the arrogant, that the person they discard does not shatter, but rises, that a woman told she is one of hundreds may walk away and become, entirely on her own, someone no one could call ordinary, precisely because she refused to accept an ordinary fate. Verity Lord had been told she was replaceable, and had answered not with grief, but with a whole life, built free, that put the lie to it more completely than any protest could have. And so, when the Duke of Ashford's long, slow year of understanding at last drove him to find her, to seek out the woman he had lost, and try, humbly, to win her back, he did not find a broken creature waiting to be rescued, grateful for his return. He found a woman who had risen without him, who needed him for nothing, who had built her own consequence out of the ruin he had offered her, and who regarded his reappearance with the calm, unimpressed clarity of a person for whom he was no longer the most important thing in the room, or indeed important at all, which was, though he did not yet know it, exactly the reception he needed, and exactly what would give him, if he could rise to it, the one real chance to become at last the man she might, freely, choose. He came to her in the autumn, a year and a season after she had left him, and he came the right way, which is to say humbly, and on his own, and prepared to be refused. He did not send word ahead. He did not arrive in state. He came to the cathedral town in a plain carriage, and he found her school, and he waited in the little parlor until the last of her pupils had gone. And when Verity Lord came into the room and found the Duke of Ashford standing in it, hat in hand, she was interested to note, almost nothing, a flicker of surprise, a distant curiosity, but not the lurch of the heart she might once have felt, and certainly not fear, and certainly not hope. He was a figure from a closed chapter of her life, and he had walked, uninvited, into the new one, and she regarded him across her own parlor, with the mild composure of a woman entirely secure in a life he had no part in. "Your Grace," she said, "this is unexpected. Have you lost your way? The London road is 2 streets north." "I have not lost my way," the Duke of Ashford said. "I have found it, rather, after a year of being thoroughly lost, and it has led me here, to you, to say a thing I should have understood a year ago, and did not. May I have a quarter of an hour of your time, Miss Lord? I have no right to it. You owe me nothing, less than nothing. But I have come a long way, and I will not trouble you again after, whatever you answer. A quarter of an hour, that is all I ask." Verity considered him. He looked, she thought, older than a year should have made him, worn and humbled, the cold arrogance she remembered replaced by something quieter and more uncertain. She was not moved by it, exactly, but she was fair, and a quarter of an hour was a small thing, and she found she was, distantly, curious what had brought the great Duke of Ashford to her little parlor, with his hat in his hands. A quarter of an hour, she agreed, and sat, and did not offer him tea, and waited. "A year ago," the Duke said, "I told you that there were hundreds like you, that you were replaceable, that I had chosen you as the least objectionable of a set of interchangeable candidates, and that you must not imagine yourself special. I said it coldly, as a kindness, so that you would enter our marriage without illusions. And you set down the ring and told me you would rather be poor and free than be my least objectionable option, and you walked out, and I thought you a fool." He turned his hat in his hands. "I have come to tell you that I was wrong, in every particular. and that I have spent a year learning exactly how wrong, and that the learning has been the most painful and the most necessary thing that has ever happened to me. There are not hundreds like you, Miss Lord. There are not two. I tried to prove there were. I met the candidates, the sensible, poor, pretty, grateful girls, exactly as I had described you, and not one of them would do, and I could not understand why, until I understood that the thing that had made you worth marrying was the very thing I had been too blind to see. That you spoke to me as a man and not a rank. That you were warm and honest, and would tell me the truth. That you did quiet good on my estate, and knew my servants' names and left clever notes in the margins of my books. That you were, in short, entirely irreplaceable, the only person who had ever brought any warmth or truth into my cold life, and that I looked at all of it and called it ordinary, and told you there were hundreds like you. His voice was not steady. You proved me wrong the moment you walked away. A replaceable woman would have taken the diamond and been grateful. Only an extraordinary one would have refused it, rather than be told she was worth nothing. Your leaving was the proof of everything I denied. And I have spent a year in a house that misses you, and a life that misses you, understanding at last that I did not lose an inconvenience. I lost the only thing of value I ever had, and I threw it away with my own words. And I have come, with no right and no expectation, to tell you that I know it now, and that I am sorry, more sorry than I have words for, and that I was the fool, not you. That is the quarter of an hour. I will not presume beyond it. Verity Lord was quiet for a moment. That is a handsome apology, she said at last, and I believe it is sincere, and I thank you for it. It cannot have been easy for a man like you to come here and say it, and I do not underestimate what it cost your pride. So I will receive it in the spirit it is offered, and I will tell you, honestly, that I forgive you, truly, without reservation. You did me a great wrong, and then, unknowing, a great kindness, because your cold words shook me out of the slow surrender I was drifting toward, and sent me here, to this school, to this life, which is entirely my own, and which I would not trade for any dukedom in England. So I bear you no ill will. I am glad you came. I am glad you understand. I forgive you. She paused. But I think you have come for more than forgiveness, Your Grace. And here I must be as honest with you as you have been with me. You have come, I think, to ask me to reconsider, to take up the diamond after all, now that you have learned my worth. And I must tell you that I will not. And I must tell you why. Because you deserve the truth, as I deserved it a year ago. Tell me, the Duke said, low. Because I no longer need you, Verity said, gently, and I find that I have discovered, this year, that need is a poor foundation for a marriage, and that being wanted is not the same as being loved, and that I will not build my life a second time on either one. A year ago, I would have married you out of need. I was poor and dependent, and you were a duke, and it was the sensible thing, and I very nearly did it even knowing you felt nothing for me, and you saved me from that, by being cruel enough to make me refuse. And now you come back having learned my worth. And you want me. I believe you do, truly. But Your Grace, I have built a life in which I need nothing from you. And so if I were to take your hand now, it could only be for one reason. The one reason that would be enough. Because I loved you, and wanted you, freely, from a position of my own, needing nothing. And I do not. That is the plain truth. Whatever I might once have felt, in the months of our engagement, I buried it a year ago, when you told me I was one of hundreds, and I have built over the grave of it a life I love, and the feeling has not come back, and I will not marry a man I do not love, merely because he has finally learned to value me. You taught me that lesson yourself, that a person is worth more than being someone's least objectionable option. Well, you are worth more too, than being married by a woman who does not love you out of pity for your year of suffering. We both deserve better than that. So no, Your Grace, I forgive you, and I wish you well, and I will not marry you. And both of those are true, and neither cancels the other. That is my honest answer, given as you gave me yours. And the Duke of Ashford, who had come prepared to be refused, and had told himself he was prepared, discovered that he was not prepared at all. That the refusal, gently and fairly given, was the most painful thing he had ever endured, precisely because it was so entirely just. She did not need him. She did not love him. She had built a life beyond him. And there was no cruelty in her refusal, no revenge, only a clear, fair honesty that mirrored, exactly, the clear, fair honesty with which she had once set down his diamond. And he understood that he was reaping, precisely, what he had sown, that he had told a woman she was replaceable, and she had gone and made herself into a woman who could replace him without difficulty, needing nothing he had to offer. He might have argued. He might, a year before, have commanded, or pressed, or used his consequence. He did none of these things, because the year had taught him better, and because he loved her, and love does not batter down the free choice of the beloved. "Then I will go," he said quietly, "and I will not trouble you again. But I am glad, Miss Lord, I am glad, past expression, that you have built a life you love, even though I have no part in it. That is a strange thing to be glad of, and I am glad of it anyway, which is how I know the year has changed me, because the man who told you there were hundreds like you could not have been glad of your happiness at his own expense. I am. Be happy. You have more than earned it. And know that somewhere in England there is a reformed fool who will think of you every day of his life, and who learned, too late, the most important thing he ever learned, from the woman who was worth more than he knew. Goodbye, Verity. Thank you for the quarter of an hour. It was worth more to me than the whole of the year that bought it." And he bowed, a deep, genuine, final bow, and he turned to go. He had reached the door when Verity spoke. "You did not command me," she said, "just now. You could have. A year ago you would have. You could have pressed your consequence, made me feel the weight of what I was refusing, argued, insisted. Other men would have. And instead you accepted my no, and wished me joy, and are leaving quietly because I asked you to." Her voice had changed, very slightly. "The man I refused a year ago could not have done that. That man did not know there was any answer to being told no except to insist. And you have just heard me refuse you, fairly, at the ruin of your hopes. And you have answered it with grace, and gladness for my happiness, and the courtesy of letting me go. That is not the man who told me there were hundreds like me. That is a different man entirely." The Duke of Ashford paused at the door, not daring to turn. "I told you the year had changed me," he said. "I did not expect you to believe it. I hardly believe it myself." "I am beginning to believe it," Verity said slowly. "And it is a great inconvenience to me, Your Grace, because I had my refusal all arranged, and it was fair and final, and I meant every word of it. And then you had to go and prove, in the manner of your leaving, that you have actually become the thing you claimed, which was the one argument I had no defense against. I said I would not marry a man I did not love. That was true when I said it. But I find, watching you accept my refusal like a man with a soul instead of a duke with a grievance, that I am no longer quite so certain the feeling is as buried as I told you. You have made me curious about the man you have become, and curiosity, Your Grace, is a great deal more dangerous to a woman's settled resolve than any amount of wanting or needing." She rose. "I will not take up the diamond. Let us be clear about that. I have not changed my mind, and I will not be won back in an afternoon by a good exit. But I will offer you a thing I did not intend to offer when you walked in, because you have earned it, and because I find I want to. Not the diamond, not the dukedom, only this, you may call, as an ordinary man calls upon a woman he wishes to know. Here, in my parlor, in my town, on my terms, where I need nothing from you and you have no power over me, and there is no arrangement, and no diamond, and no family requiring anything of anyone. You may court me, Your Grace, slowly, from nothing, as an equal, and we shall discover, freely, whether the man you have become and the woman I have made are people who might choose each other. I promise you nothing but the chance. But the chance, I find, I am willing to give, which astonishes me a great deal more than it can possibly astonish you." And the Duke of Ashford turned at last from the door and looked at Verity Lord standing in the little parlor of the life she had built without him, offering him, not a rescue, not a restoration, but a chance, freely given, from a position of her own complete independence, and understood that it was infinitely more than he deserved, and exactly, precisely, the only thing worth having. the chance to be freely chosen by a woman who needed him for nothing, and might, if he proved worthy, come to want him for himself. A chance, he said, and his voice broke on it, is more than I came for, and more than I deserve, and I will not waste it. Thank you, Verity. I will call tomorrow, if I may, as an ordinary man, and I will spend however long it takes proving that the fool who told you there were hundreds like you has learned that there was only ever the one. He courted her for the better part of a year, the second year, the good one, and he did it entirely on her terms, in her town, in her parlor, as an ordinary man, with no diamond and no dukedom pressed upon her, until the choosing, when it finally came, was so entirely free and so entirely hers that neither of them could ever doubt it. And it was a joy, that courtship, in a way their first cold engagement had never been, because this time there was no arrangement, no family requiring it, no least objectionable calculation. There were only two people, meeting as equals, one who needed nothing and one who had learned everything, discovering that they liked each other enormously, that they always had, underneath the ice, and that the warm, honest humanity Verity had once brought into his cold life, she now brought freely, as a gift rather than a duty, to a man who had learned at last exactly what it was worth. He came to her school and helped her pupils with their sums. He learned the names of everyone in her town as he had learned the names of his tenants, because she had taught him to see people, and he could not unsee them now. He argued with her, and was told plain truths by her, and laughed the real laugh she drew out of him, and was, for the first time in his life, happy, not gratified, not admired, but happy, in the small, warm, ordinary way he had once been too grand to imagine. There was one afternoon in that second year that Verity kept as the moment she stopped guarding herself entirely. The Duke had been helping in the schoolroom. He had taken to it absurdly. The great Duke of Ashford, hearing small girls recite their multiplication tables and praising them gravely when they got them right. And one of her pupils, a shy, motherless child named Suki, who was slower than the rest, and painfully aware of it, had frozen on her sums, scarlet with shame, on the edge of tears, exactly as such children do. And Verity had watched the Duke of Ashford kneel down beside the little girl's bench, the man who had once told a woman there were hundreds like her, and say, gently, "Do you know, when I was your age, I could not do these at all, and I had a great many tutors and no excuse, and you are doing them with far less help and far more courage than I ever had. Take your time. There is no hurry. Numbers are patient. They will wait for you. Let us do this one together, slowly, and you will find it is not so fierce as it looks." And he had walked the child through it, patiently, until she got it, and her whole small face had lit with the astonished pride of a child who has been made to feel clever instead of stupid. And Verity, watching from across the room, had felt the last of her careful resistance quietly give way, because that was the thing she had been waiting to see, though she had not known it. Anyone could apologize handsomely. Anyone could court prettily. But the man who told a frightened, slow, motherless child that numbers were patient and would wait for her, the man who knelt on a schoolroom floor to spare a nobody's little girl a moment's shame, when there was no one to impress but a schoolmistress he was still trying to win, and when the child could do nothing for him ever, that man was not performing. That man had become, somewhere in his terrible year, genuinely kind, kind all the way down, kind to the powerless when it gained him nothing, which is the only kindness that counts. The Duke who had catalogued her replaceability could not have knelt by Suki's bench. This one did it without thinking, because it had become who he was. "You are very good with her," Verity said, after the children had gone. "With Suki. She is the hardest of them to reach. The others have given up on her, and she has half given up on herself, and you reached her in an afternoon. That was kindly done, Julian. And you did not know I was watching. Or rather, you did, but you were not doing it for me. I could see that. You were doing it for her. I have been waiting, I think, without quite admitting it, to catch you being good when it did not serve you. I have caught you now. It is a great inconvenience." "You keep telling me I am an inconvenience," the Duke said, smiling. "The best exit is an inconvenience. A good apology is an inconvenience. Kindness to a child is an inconvenience. I begin to suspect, Miss Lord, that I am winning, and that it is annoying you. You are winning, Verity admitted, and it is annoying me, and I find I do not mind nearly as much as I ought. She looked at him a moment, the fierce, clear look he had come to love. I told you a year ago that the feeling was buried and would not come back. I was wrong, it seems. It has been coming back for months, one kindness at a time, and I have been pretending not to notice, because I was so very determined to be sensible, and to make you earn it, and to protect the life I built. But I watched you kneel by that child's bench today, and I find the pretending has become more work than it is worth. I am not going to say the rest of it yet. You may still work for that. It will do you good, and I am enjoying watching you do it. But I will say this much, and then I will make us tea. The woman who refused you 2 years ago would not have wept, just now, watching you teach a little girl her sums. I very nearly did. Make of that what you like, Your Grace. I am going to put the kettle on before I say anything further that I have not properly decided to say. And she had gone to make the tea, flustered for the first time in the whole of their second courtship. And the Duke of Ashford had watched her go with his heart in his throat, and understood that he had, against every expectation, and entirely by deserving it, begun at last to be freely loved by the one woman he had once been fool enough to call one of hundreds. And Verity, watching the great cold Duke of Ashford become, week by week, a warm and ordinary and thoroughly beloved man, found the buried feeling come back up out of its grave, not as it had been, the wary, hopeful thing of a poor girl toward a duke, but as something better, the free, clear love of an independent woman who had considered a man carefully, from a position of complete security, and decided, needing nothing, wanting only him, that she chose him. She told him so on a spring evening in her own garden, and she did the proposing, because she had done the refusing, and thought it only fair. I have decided, she said, that I love you, freely, from my own life, needing nothing, wanting only you, the man you have become, not the Duke I refused. And having decided it, I find I do not wish to wait, or to be courted further, or to play out the pretty forms. I refused you once, plainly, and I will propose to you now, plainly, because plainness is the one currency we have always trusted. Marry me, Julian. Not because your family requires it, or because I am poor, or because you have learned my worth, but because two free people who need nothing from each other have looked at each other clearly and chosen, out of the whole wide world, to spend their lives together. That is the only marriage worth having. It is the opposite of the one you offered me 2 years ago. Will you have it? Will you have me, not as one of hundreds, and not as a rescue, but as the one free woman in England, who has considered you entirely and chosen you anyway? And the Duke of Ashford, who had once told this woman there were hundreds like her, went down on his knees in her garden and wept, and said yes, and yes, and yes, and understood, kneeling before the woman he had nearly lost forever to his own cold arrogance, that he was the most fortunate fool in England, saved from himself by the very act that had once seemed his greatest inconvenience, a woman with dignity enough to walk away. They were married that summer, in her cathedral town, among her pupils and her townsfolk, and her life, rather than in the great cold splendor of Ashford Court, because Verity would have it so, and the Duke, who had learned by then that she was nearly always right, agreed gladly, and the Duchess of Ashford kept her school. She would not give it up, and he would not have asked her to, and it became one of the wonders of the county, a duchess who taught the daughters of tradesmen their sums, who had built a life of her own before she ever built one with her husband, and who was known to tell any young woman who would listen the one lesson she had bought so dearly and valued above all others. If a man ever tells you there are hundreds like you, the Duchess of Ashford would say, believe him and leave, not out of pride and not for revenge, but because a person who can say such a thing to you does not yet know your worth, and you cannot teach it to him by staying. You can only teach it to him by going, if he is capable of learning it at all, and if he is not, then you are well rid of him. I was told there were hundreds like me. I set down a diamond and walked into poverty rather than believe it, and I built a whole life to prove it false. And do you know what happened? The man who said it spent a year discovering he had lost the only one. They are always the only one, my dears. Every single person is the only one. There have never been hundreds like anybody. And the tragedy is how many women spend their whole lives being told otherwise, and believing it. Do not believe it. Walk away, and rise, and let the ones who could not see your worth discover it in your absence. And if, like mine, one of them proves able to learn, then let him find you already risen, already whole, already enough on your own, and let him choose you, and choose him, freely, from strength. That is the only love worth having. I know, because I very nearly married the other kind, and was saved from it by 4 cold words and my own 2 feet walking out a door.